Good evening. My name is Maeve Clark, and I'm the Coordinator of Adult Services here at the library. Welcome to the final program in Iowa City Public Library's series commemorating the Civil War. The library is one of 50 libraries in the United States to receive the multi-panel exhibit Civil War 150 and a grant supporting programming related to the Civil War from the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Library of America. If you haven't viewed the display, please do. It will be in the gallery area of the first floor through Sunday, May 12th. We began our series of programs with the Reading Aloud group from the Iowa City Johnson County Senior Center sharing the poetry of Walt Whitman. And we end with this evening's program, Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, Mathew Brady, and the Civil War, Making Art Out of Mass Death. One of the highlights of planning the programming with our programming librarian Beth Fisher and Professor Leslie Schwalm, University of Iowa Civil War historian, has been the opportunity to ask Professor Ed Folsom, a preeminent scholar of Walt Whitman, to present tonight's program. I was fortunate to have heard and seen Professor Folsom's lecture on Whitman, Dickinson, Brady, and the Civil War when he shared it with the University of Iowa History of Medicine Society. I thought at that time we need to have him do this presentation at the library to bring it to a wider audience, as we not only have the audience here in the room tonight, but we have the audience live on the library's channel, and we will re-air it, and he has kindly given us permission to stream it from the library's website. So that is a fulfillment of a goal that I've had after having seen that program. Professor Folsom is the Roy J. Carver Professor of English at the University of Iowa, where he has taught since 1976. He has been awarded the President and Provost Teaching Award, the Collegiate Teaching Award, the Regents Award for Faculty Excellence. He is the recipient of 5 grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities and received the University of Rochester Distinguished Scholar Award. He has been a senior Fulbright Scholar in Germany, has directed international conferences in the United States and China, and has lectured widely in 14 countries. 3 of his publications have been awarded the Choice Outstanding Academic Book of the Year. Professor Folsom.
Thank you very much, Maeve. The Civil War, of course, changed everything for the United States, and it became America's first confrontation with mass death. Death and injury on a scale previously unimaginable. What does a poet, what do any of us do with mass death? And once you've experienced it, how do you keep writing poetry? What art can grow out of an encounter with mass death and unspeakable injury? How is it possible to make poetry out of the pain and grief brought on by mass death? Numerous poets in the 20th century, while experiencing 2 world wars, would discover unsettling answers to these questions. But tonight I want to look with you at the ways America's 2 most innovative 19th century poets, Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson, became the first to wrest an art out of that horrific experience. When any war begins, most people think it will be over quickly. In the recent history of wars in which the United States has been involved, many people can still remember the comments of Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld on the eve of the Iraq War. Quote, "It is unknowable how long that conflict will last. It could last 6 days, 6 weeks, I doubt 6 months." Vice President Richard Cheney agreed that, quote, "It'll go relatively quickly, weeks rather than months." It was no different for Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson on the front edge of the Civil War. Like the United States initiating a war in Iraq that one of the president's advisors blithely predicted would be a cakewalk that would be over in a couple of weeks, most northern and southern observers predicted the Civil War would be a brief and clean little war, over in a matter of weeks, if not days. A great and cautious national official, Walt Whitman recalled, predicted that the war would blow over in 60 days, and folks generally believed the prediction. Civil War histories are full of the stories of people who packed picnic lunches to go sit on the hills to watch the Battle of Bull Run, only to be shocked into horror as the Northern troops beat a retreat into Washington. Where are the vaunts and the proud boasts with which you went forth, Whitman asked after Bull Run. Where are your banners and your bands of music and your ropes to bring back your prisoners? Well, there isn't a band playing, and there isn't a flag but clings ashamed and lank to its staff. A year and a half later, Whitman would be down at the war front in Fredericksburg, Virginia, looking after his injured soldier brother, and was now wondering how long this suddenly very bloody quagmire would last. As he approached the mansion that was used as a hospital, he passed by a heap of amputated feet, legs, arms, hands, etc., a full load for a one-horse cart. It was the first indication he had that this would be a war of amputation, eventually severing an entire generation of American males from the country's future. That pile of body parts that Whitman encountered, like some grotesque parody of his life-affirming poetic catalogs, became the stubborn reality he would have to learn to incorporate in his radically altered post-1860 poetry. Now, instead of absorbing an ameliorative, evolving, progressive, expanding self and nation and cosmos into his affirmative song, he would begin cataloging mass death. This grisly catalog would eventually expand to over 600,000 casualties. Projected as a percentage of the nation's population, we'd be talking about nearly 7 million dead young men today. For the poet of the body, who believed the soul only existed when it took on flesh and bone, when it gained a body so that it could act in the world, for this poet, the war was an attack on the American soul, leaving a generation of American men dead or disfigured. How could the soul of a generation function without legs, the very means of locomotion, of moving in the world, or without hands and arms, the means of doing work in the world? Whitman had published 3 editions of his life's work, Leaves of Grass, before the Civil War, and he would publish 3 more after the war. That's the 1855 edition, the first edition, and that's the 1860 edition, the edition that he published right before the Civil War began. Before the war, he saw his book as an effort to hold the country together, to catalog its vast diversity into unifying poems that would celebrate contradiction and teach America to live with it, to thrive on it. But once America came apart at the seams during the war, violently broke in two, Whitman's poetry changed. Now, instead of cataloging the vast variety of life in the nation, he found himself cataloging a seemingly endless accumulation of deaths. We can find pieces of this catalog throughout Whitman's wartime poetry, collected in his book called Drum Taps, but perhaps never so effectively as in his prose memoranda during the war, where he writes the longest sentence that he would ever compose, inventing a syntax of mass death, an undiagrammable utterance that wanders the ruined nation to gather up what he calls the infinite dead, pausing again and again to absorb the horror, the details, the unimaginable numbers of dead young men whose bodies eluded the grave and were composted back into the landscape itself. You have a copy of the sentence on the sheet that I handed out. This is a sentence so long and so intricate that Whitman originally wrote it out as a poem, lined so as to create one of his characteristic poetic catalogs, but this one a catalog of death. He worked and reworked it, embedding more and more details in the cascade of death data about the war. The sentence eventually buries 7 parenthetical insertions among its 30-some dashes, creating a jagged syntactical field sliced with phrasal trenches. And this astonishing catalog of a sentence ends up, after its nearly 400 words, being a sentence fragment. There's no way, Whitman discovered, to predicate this subject, the dead in this war. These numberless dead are, of course, beyond animation, themselves now fragments of bodies, amputated selves, irretrievable, that have so saturated America's land that we, the living, are now all fated to reap forevermore a harvest of death, with blood in every grain we eat. The dead in this war, there they lie, strewing the fields and woods and valleys and battlefields of the South, Virginia, the Peninsula, Malvern Hill and Fair Oaks, the banks of the Chickahominy, the terraces of Fredericksburg, Antietam Bridge, the grisly ravines of Manassas, the bloody promenade of the Wilderness, the varieties of the strayed dead. The estimate of the War Department is 25,000 national soldiers killed in battle and never buried at all, 5,000 drowned, 15,000 inhumed by strangers or on the march in haste in hitherto unfound localities, 2,000 graves covered by sand and mud by Mississippi freshets, 3,000 carried away by caving in of banks, etc. Gettysburg, the West, Southwest, Vicksburg, Chattanooga, the trenches of Petersburg, the numberless battles, camps, hospitals everywhere, the crop reaped by the mighty reapers, typhoid, dysentery, inflammations, and the blackest and loathsomest of all, the dead and living burial pits, the prison pens of Andersonville, Salisbury, Belle Isle, etc. Not Dante's pictured hell and all its woes, its degradations, filthy torments excelled those prisons. The dead, the dead, the dead, our dead, or south or north, ours all, all, all finally dear to me, or east or west, Atlantic coast or Mississippi Valley, somewhere they crawled to die, alone, in bushes, low gullies, or on the sides of hills. There in secluded spots, their skeletons, bleached bones, tufts of hair, buttons, fragments of clothing are occasionally found yet. Our young men, once so handsome and so joyous, taken from us, the son from the mother, the husband from the wife, the dear friend from the dear friend. The clusters of camp graves in Georgia, the Carolinas, and in Tennessee, the single graves left in the woods or by the roadsides, hundreds, thousands obliterated. The corpses floated down the rivers and caught and lodged. Dozens, scores floated down the upper Potomac after the cavalry engagements, the pursuit of Lee following Gettysburg. Some lie at the bottom of the sea. The general million and the special cemeteries in almost all the states, the infinite dead, the land entire saturated, perfumed with their impalpable ashes exhalation, in nature's chemistry distilled, and shall be so forever. In every future grain of wheat and ear of corn, and every flower that grows, and every breath we draw. Not only northern dead leavening southern soil, thousands, aye, tens of thousands of Southerners crumble today in northern earth. At the end of this sentence, we see nature's chemistry at work again, just as it was in Whitman's pre-war poem called This Compost, where he celebrated the way that science was teaching us how nothing really died, but was only recycled into a new ongoing life, turned into soil that nurtures the new plants, the leaves of grass that grow out of the grave, like so many thousands of uttering tongues telling us in their voiceless way that there is no death. In this compost, Whitman had shouted with wonder, "What chemistry!" as he cataloged the myriad spring plants bursting out of the soil that was nothing but the fertile compost of the dead. But here, The chemistry is buried in parentheses instead of proudly claiming an exclamatory line of its own. That chemistry is doing its same relentless work of turning death back into life. But the vastness of the death that now needs to be processed is so overwhelming, it will enter our food supply, infect the air we breathe. But it will leaven the soil, become the transforming agent of death to life as it turns bodies back into the wheat and corn that sustain us. And in the word leaven, we see Whitman's always present leave, the leavings of death that become the leaves of grass. What heaven there is for Whitman is leaven. We, the living, are what the dead have of an afterlife, as their death makes available the atoms that will rise in new forms. Whitman entitled this section of his memoranda, "The Million Dead, Too, Summed Up," using his characteristic contraction apostrophe, which here creates a kind of haunting ambiguity, because the sentence, with all its embedded statistics, its death data, does give us the Civil War dead summed up, but the contraction also invites us to fill in a few more missing letters, as we realize that this death sentence literally summons up the dead, reminding us of their literal physical presence throughout the landscape, north and south, and insisting on their physical emergence in everything that grows from the soil they dissolved into. It's a vast national compost. Whitman loved apostrophes in the double sense of that word. Apostrophe comes from the Greek meaning averting or turning away. It referred to the part of an oration in which the speaker turns away from the audience to address someone who's not there, who might just be absent or might be dead, or in Whitman's reckoning, might yet not be born. Whitman built his poetry on the apostrophe. The faith that he could address readers who were not there did not yet exist when he wrote and published his poems. The poets to come who would encounter the dead via the ever-present mediation of the poem itself. Apostrophe came to indicate also that raised comma that acknowledges missing letters in a word. It did so because of the grammatical parallel to the rhetorical event. That is, just as an orator might pause in his address to an audience to speak to someone not there, so did the little raised comma create a pause in a word to acknowledge absent letters. Whitman, who cautioned himself always to know the etymologies of words before using them, knew this etymology well. Whitman's work is full of apostrophes of both kinds, addresses to people he could never have known or seen, but claims to have anticipated nonetheless, and little marks indicating absences everywhere in his words, as is the case throughout that sentence we just looked at, and here in the title itself. The million dead, too, summed up. There's something missing in that summed. There were now 1 million young men in the U.S. who could no longer be addressed directly. He can sum them up, he can total the loss, but he cannot summon them up again except by an apostrophe to the dead, an apostrophe we see hanging in the absent space of the title. It's the million dead summoned up. Whitman's catalog is a summing and a summoning, and the summons is not just of the dead, but also of the living, who are being summoned to witness this mass death, and grotesque as it may seem, to ingest it, to take communion with it, to live off of it, to make a future out of it. We who remain are the leavings, the afterlife. The writer Whitman most revered, Ralph Waldo Emerson, left his Unitarian ministry over his refusal to administer what Whitman called the conventional communion service. Whitman's poetry is in some essential ways based on his own radical reconception of a democratic communion more stunning than any that religion has imagined. It was not just Christ's body and blood that were endlessly recycled and ingested, as is the case in conventional Christian communion. Instead, Whitman suggests all life and death are an endless cycle of composting communion. I do not talk of the beginning and the end, Whitman says. He had expressed this faith ever since he first published Leaves of Grass in 1855. The soul is an endless process of compost, breaking down and reforming, composition, decomposition, and recomposition. We all ingest dead matter to live on and turn death to life. Resurrection is a daily, hourly physical activity for all of us. We can only live by eating death. But the Civil War forced Whitman to expand his radical spirituality further than he ever had before. Mass death made him imagine a kind of wildly unconventional, democratized communion, one in which every citizen who survived the war would now take and eat of the soldiers whose bodies now merged with the land, saturated it. For Whitman, every one of the over 800,000 soldiers who died had become as significant as Christ himself, as potent a symbol of loss and rebirth as any in history. In his Drum Taps poem called A Sight in Camp in the Daybreak Gray and Dim, Whitman lifts the blanket from a dead soldier to realize that, quote, this face is the face of the Christ himself, dead and divine and brother of all, and here again he lies. Multiply this face hundreds of thousands of times. Distribute the crucified Christ throughout the nation, where the battlefields were often our farms, our towns, our rivers, our woods. And then realize what an uncanny communion is forced upon those who survived the war. Following his long sentence about death and memoranda during the war, Whitman goes on to note how many of these countless graves contain the significant word unknown. In some of the cemeteries, he writes, nearly all the dead are unknown. Returning to battlefields and cemeteries 10 years after the war, Whitman writes of how these soldiers have left little trace as the relentless fertility of nature and forgetfulness greens the infected land. Quote, from 10 years' rain and snow in their seasons, grass, clover, pine trees, orchards, forests, from all the noiseless miracles of soil and sun and running streams, how peaceful and how beautiful appear today even the battle trenches and the many 100,000 cemetery mounds. As we summon up the dead, then, Whitman indicates, there are always absences, like the missing letters in his suggestive contractions. Much will always be missing in this summons. Meanwhile, up in Amherst, Massachusetts, America's other great 19th century poet, Emily Dickinson, was experiencing the mass death in a different but no less horrific way. Instead of a pile of amputated limbs, she was seeing, day after day, a pile of amputated names. Those lists and lists of the dead and wounded that American newspapers carried then as they do today. As the list got longer, mass death came to be, as inevitably it has to, anonymous death. We can't keep track of the cascading faces and names and the vast black slabs of the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C., with its endless rows of names, capture what Dickinson would have experienced as the newspaper arrived each day, invading her home with these lists of names now severed from their identities, cut off from the young lives they had so recently been the signs of. It was from just such a list of casualties in the New York Herald that Whitman picked out his brother George's name, the name itself mangled, Whitmore instead of Whitman, just like the soldier it indicated, that led Walt to the Fredericksburg battlefield and changed the course of his life and his poetry. Dickinson's response was no less unsettling, and you have this poem on the sheet I handed out. They dropped like flakes. They dropped like stars, like petals from a rose, when suddenly across the June a wind with fingers goes. They perished in the seamless grass. No eye could find the place. But God can summon every face on his repealless list. This poem was probably written around the time that Whitman read his brother George's name on a list and went to Fredericksburg to experience the accumulating death firsthand, and then stayed in Washington to catalog in his little notebooks thousands upon thousands of wounded and dying soldiers that he visited in the hospitals there. When Whitman gives us mass death, eventually composting the soil so that bloody death grows up in flowers and grain and corn and perfumes the air itself, Dickinson gives us an image of a world, a universe, dropping things in masses, each individual death like a snowflake lost in the vast accumulation of snow, like a falling star disappearing amidst the millions, like petals stripped from a rose by a cold wind in a warm month, its invisible fingers stripping the red life in the midst of the growing season. Like Whitman's mass of unknown graves that seem to heal back into leaves of grass, the dead in Dickinson's poem perish in the seamless grass, which grows over and closes the seam of the grave, leaving the dead now seamless, the dead now seem less. No eye could find the place. The living, as Whitman reminds us, have more and more trouble remembering, and the dead, as their numbers proliferate, have less and less identity. After a while, no eye could find the place. All the dead are unknown, Whitman reminds us. What sounds like a conventional and comforting religious conclusion to Dickinson's poem is, as always, more ambiguous than it may at first seem. Dickinson's God always seems to her careless with life, which is to him a thing as easy to efface as to invent. A God more concerned, as she says in one poem, with his perturbless plan than with the murmuring, perished patterns. It's easy to invent a life. God does it every day. Creation, but the gamble of his authority. It's easy to efface it. The thrifty deity could scarce afford eternity to spontaneity. The perished patterns murmur, but his perturbless plan proceed, inserting here a son, there leaving out a man. So in They Dropped Like Flakes, a poem about lists, God seems to have a big one, as if those expanding lists in the newspapers, as the short war dragged on into a very long war, were some journalistic equivalent of God's repealless list. His supposedly complete list of all of our dates of effacement. But what comfort to the living is God's summons? What comfort to the living is it that God can recall each face as he effaces it, if the living eye cannot find a trace? And it's not just God's summons here. Like Whitman summoning up the million dead, Dickinson's poem ends on its own kind of contraction, as she inserts a dash between repealus and list, leaving what seems to be a noun hanging at the end of the poem, where it suddenly doubles as a verb, summoning us. Listen, list. In Shakespeare's Hamlet, the ghost of Hamlet's father, in a chilling moment, demands of his son that he, quote, lend thy serious hearing to what I shall unfold. List, list, oh, list. Dickinson, too, often listens to the dead and tortures herself by what she cannot hear. The living tell the dying, she says, but a syllable, the coy dead, none. And they drop like flakes. When we hear list as a command, a summons, it literally interrupts the conventional comforting statement that seems to be forming the conclusion of the poem and asks us instead to use our senses to listen to the silence of the dropping flakes, the muteness of the list of names of the dead. What follows the command to listen is nothing, no sound. We cannot hear to hear if there's anything to hear. It's a result of such profound silences that Dickinson finds herself saying, as she does in another poem about the mass death of the Civil War, it feels a shame to be alive when men so dead, so brave, are dead. And you have this poem as well. For her, the dissolving of soldiers into the landscape is every bit as horrifying as it was for Whitman, but it comes for her without his serene ecological faith in the power of compost to turn death to life again. For Dickinson, the process is even more violent, a mortar and pestle procedure, where God seems the implied agent of grinding as we, the living, look on. Are we that wait sufficient worth, that such enormous pearl as life dissolved to be for us in battle's horrid bowl? Whitman would see in When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed what he calls battle corpses, myriads of them, and the white skeletons of young men. And he would cast them all as, quote, the debris of all the slain soldiers of the war, recognizing that these now dissolved beings, as he says, suffered not, but rather the living remained and suffered. Whitman, like Dickinson, would question whether the living were worth the sacrifice of mass death. And much of the rest of his life would be dedicated to trying to imagine an America that would be worthy of the sacrifice of a generation of young men. But he would never put this sacrifice in the stark economic terms that Dickinson did. The price is great, sublimely paid. Do we deserve a thing that lives like dollars must be piled before we may obtain? Whatever the unspecified thing is that these mass deaths, these young men's lives piled up in lists or stacks like dollars, whatever this thing is these mass deaths have paid for, cannot be worth it. Can it? Can we imagine ourselves worth this stack of corpses? When we see the corpses as dollars, as payment for something we are obtaining, how can we live with ourselves? The poem ends with one of Dickinson's most enigmatic stanzas. It may be a renown to live. I think the man who die, those unsustained saviors, present divinity. As with Whitman's view of each dead soldier as Christ himself, here Whitman slips from the singular man, which incongruously takes on a plural verb, die, instead of the singular dies, and blurs the one soldier into an overwhelming host of unsustained saviors, as it becomes difficult to hang on to the significance of any single death in the face of hundreds of thousands. These endless dead soldiers multiply Christ, just as Whitman did by identifying one anonymous dead soldier as having the face of Christ himself. And their renown outshines any that living heroes might accrue, as they bring us close to God, our God, precisely because they are now unseen, but nonetheless sustain us. They present divinity, or present divinity. Present it to us and make it present to us by their very absence. In the parlance of religion and war, we live because they died. They died so we may live. And now, Dickinson suggests, with such an overwhelming accumulation of death around us, can we live with that knowledge? There's much more we could say about how Whitman and Dickinson invent ways of writing mass death. But finally, I want to say just a couple of things about another mode of representing mass death that emerged at the same time Whitman's and Dickinson's poetry did, and that, of course, is photography. The Civil War becomes our first photographed war. Photography is a technology that grows up with the emerging military technologies of mass death. And it's no mistake that photography from the beginning shares the diction of weaponry. A camera is aimed and shots are taken. And from the beginning of the art in the late 1840s, many Americans, and not just American Indians, found it threatening and intrusive and worried that each photograph somehow uncannily stole a little bit of your life. Susan Sontag and others have demonstrated just how enmeshed photography and war have been ever since the Civil War was shot on film. Because of the state of the camera and film technology at the time, photography could not absorb actual battle. Exposure times blurred quick action, cameras were large and bulky, had to be placed on tripods, plates had to be prepared and quickly developed, requiring darkroom carts to be dragged along with the photographer, and so on. And so we've come to know the Civil War visually through the things that mid-19th century photography could capture: the preparations and the after effects of battles. I mentioned earlier that Whitman's long prose sentence about absorbing the war offers us a literal image of the harvest of death by portraying all of America's farm fields now composting blood and bone and decomposed flesh back into corn and grain. One of the most familiar photos of the Civil War, taken by one of Mathew Brady's assistants, is also titled Harvest of Death. And it shows the Gettysburg battlefield, also a farm field, strewn with corpses. Photography then came, of course, only in black and white, and the dark exposures create an almost moonlit cast in many Civil War shots. Whitman, who knew Brady and was a good friend of Brady's assistant Alexander Gardner, who took many of the war shots, wrote a powerful little poem that seems to put into words the dim-lit black and white battlefield and the multitude of corpses lying upon what was also a farm field, a place of harvest. Look down, fair moon, and bathe this scene. Pour softly down night's nimbus floods on faces ghastly, swollen, purple, on the dead on their backs with arms tossed wide. Pour down your unstinted nimbus, sacred moon. Whitman does not flinch from looking at the swollen, ghastly faces, but he uses the light to create a kind of halo over the scene. Dickinson, on the other hand, in a poem that seems to respond to the same photographic scene, looks hard and close at the ghastly, swollen faces, and notes the ways that the mouths are frozen open in a final moan, notes the fragments of papers, often prayers or religious tracts from the soldiers' pockets, strewn over the field, notes the rolled-up eyeballs in the gaping eyes. Her battlefield scene, like Brady's, and I'm quoting here from another one of Dickinson's poems, "'Tis populous with bone and stain, and men too straight to stoop again, and piles of solid moan, and chips of blank in boyish eyes, and scraps of prayer, and death's surprise stamped visible in stone." The photograph stamps death visible, and the stone stillness of the photograph sculpts the dead into unbending, blank, silent forms, as does the excruciating sculpting of Dickinson's imagery, creating a poetic rigor mortis. It is different from and more unyielding than Whitman's mass dead, who are still in motion as nature's chemistry casts a nimbus around them, then transforms them into our bloody nutriment, our future. One thing, then, that distinguishes the poetry Whitman made out of mass death from the poetry Dickinson wrested from that carnage is that Whitman was working to create not just a poetry, but a future out of the countless corpses. For him, the obligation of those who survived the Civil War was to make a future that would be worthy of that vast sacrifice. This, I think, is why Whitman had a lifelong identity with doctors. The poet and the physician both confronted pain and death with a belief that confronting it was worth the effort, that something positive could emerge from it. That's why in his memoranda during the war, the surgeons were, with few exceptions, heroic. Quote, "I must bear my most emphatic testimony to the zeal, manliness, and professional spirit and capacity generally prevailing among the surgeons, many of them young men in the hospitals and the army, for these were the best men and the hardest and most disinterested workers. They're full of genius, too. I've seen many hundreds of them, and this is my testimony." They were disinterested, and that disinterest steadied their nerves, allowed them to confront the horror and not give out, but rather get to work, to use their genius. But they too were overwhelmed by the unimaginable scope of the slaughter and unable to help more than a fraction that cried out for help. Quote, "Of all harrowing experiences, none is greater than that of the days following a heavy battle," Whitman writes. "Scores, hundreds of the noblest men on earth, uncomplaining, lie helpless, mangled, faint, alone, and so bleed to death, or die from exhaustion, either actually untouched at all, or merely the laying of them down and leaving them where there ought to be means provided to save them." There's something so achingly present in Whitman's small but telling phrase, "actually untouched at all." The worst horror is not to die in excruciating pain, but to die untouched at all. Whitman devoted one of his most powerful war poems, The Wound Dresser, to evoking the power of touch and to capturing the importance of disinterest, of maintaining an exterior calm while the horror of the slaughter burns deep into the soul. The poem imagines a wound dresser in a Civil War hospital making his rounds. "I dress the perforated shoulder, the foot with the bullet wound, cleanse the one with a gnawing and putrid gangrene so sickening, so offensive, while the attendant stands behind beside me, holding the tray and pale. I am faithful, I do not give out. The fractured thigh, the knee, the wound in the abdomen, these and more I dress with impassive hand, yet deep in my breast a fire, a burning flame. The final parenthetical phrase, separates itself from the impassive hand, as if the fire of his emotions cannot be fully acknowledged or given voice, for fear it would overwhelm him and leave him useless amidst the horror he's attending to. The wound dresser's hand must remain impassive, in control, disinterested, able to do its grisly work without wavering. The burning flame within the wound dresser's breast, the fire of impassioned response to the horrors he's attending to, has to be kept deep below the surface in order to allow that hand to keep functioning and to prevent the flame from consuming him. And he knows finally as he wanders among the dying that the best he can do is offer them a touch. Oops. The hurt and wounded I pacify with soothing hand. I sit by the restless all the dark night. Some are so young. Some suffer so much. I recall the experience, sweet and sad. Many a soldier's loving arms about this neck have crossed and rested. Many a soldier's kiss dwells on these bearded lips. That's how the poem ends, on a statement again wrapped in parentheses, expressing with some half-suppressed combination of amazement, guilt, and gratitude the affection that the poet has managed to wrest from the horror, the moments of tender touch that allow him to draw something sweet from an experience so sad. So after the Civil War, as Reconstruction staggered toward conclusion and Whitman began to see that the nation that was re-emerging after the war was not, in fact, a nation that seemed worth those nearly 1 million dead, he turned once again to his association with doctors to unflinchingly diagnose America's disease. Quote, I say we had best look our times and lands searchingly in the face, like a physician diagnosing some deep disease, he wrote at the beginning of Democratic Vistas. Never was there perhaps more hollowness at heart than at present, and here in the United States. Like a physician diagnosing some deep disease. This had become for Whitman the role of the poet in his culture, not there to celebrate anymore so much as to diagnose, always assessing what measures can be taken to restore the body politic to health, or assessing if the disease has in fact progressed too far. This will always be the challenge. Confronting pain and suffering and death, you must ask yourself, what can I make of this? What art, indeed what future, can rise from it? Writers in the 20th century would work endlessly to discover how they could make the horrors of war writable. But Whitman and Dickinson, facing America's mass death in its bloody Civil War, invented the poetry of mass death. Thank you.
If anybody has questions, you have to speak into the microphone so the people at home can hear the questions. But I have to turn it off. Okay. How would the public have read or known about Whitman's and Dickinson's poems during the Civil War?
Well, two very different ways. Whitman was publishing his Civil War poems in newspapers, and they were widely published in major New York newspapers, some in the New York Times. And then in 1865, at the end of the war, he put out the Drum Taps volume. A lot of his journalism of the Civil War and his that grew out of his diaries of working mostly in the Civil War hospitals were also published in newspapers. He was a war correspondent for the New York Times, and a lot of those of you that, well, you all have access here at the library to the New York Times archives, and we've discovered over the last few years with 19th century newspaper archives becoming more and more available, a lot of articles that Whitman wrote that were published and republished in many newspapers across the land. So Whitman's work would have been quite widely known and was quite widely commented on. Dickinson published 10 poems during her lifetime, all of them anonymously. The interesting thing about the very few poems she published is that most of those were published in Civil War magazines and journals. Some of them were Civil War poems that dealt with the war in Dickinson's characteristically oblique fashion. So some readers read the poems, that handful of poems, without knowing who wrote them. But only her, what she considered her reading public, her family, her very close friends, largely her sister-in-law, Susan Dickinson, to whom she sent a lot of her poems and got comments back from her on the poems. But she really was, during her lifetime, part of the manuscript public tradition. She wrote poems for a very close circle of friends. And she sent a lot of her poems over the course of her lifetime to Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who was an editor at the Atlantic magazine, an officer who led the 1st Regiment of Black Soldiers in the Civil War, a really remarkable writer and soldier and personality in the 19th century. He always advised Dickinson not to publish because he felt that her poetry was undisciplined and needed work. After her death, he was an editor of her poetry along with the mistress of Dickinson's brother, who became the other editor, and they did fix up her poems, changed her slant rhymes to perfect rhymes, added punctuation, and dressed the poems up for publication, which happened within 6 years after her death. But during the Civil War itself, Whitman's work would have been widely known and was widely known. Dickinson's handful of published poems would have been read by a very small readership of these small journals, but without ever knowing who had written them. It's only been in the last 10 years or so that, or 15 years, that there's been much attention paid in Dickinson scholarship. There's a huge amount of Dickinson scholarship, but only in the last 15 years or so have people really begun to go through those poems and see that there's a reason that during the 1860s, the early 1860s, she wrote the vast majority of her poems. She was really responding in all kinds of ways to the war, in ways that remarkably for 150 years, people just didn't see. But in the last 15 years or so, as readers have gone back and really looked at those poems and begun thinking of them in the context of the war, suddenly we find these amazingly powerful documents responding to that distanced but still heartfelt sense of loss. For so long, people thought, well, Dickinson was in Amherst, isolated from the war, and she really didn't have much to say about it. But she was writing to Higginson and admired Higginson tremendously and worried about Higginson when he went off to lead the black troops in the war, because one of the things that happened almost exactly 150 years ago last week, was the Confederate Congress instituted in response to the Emancipation Proclamation directives that any white officer leading black troops who was captured would be put to death. A special law written into the Confederate legal structure that would punish white officers for leading black troops into war. So Dickinson would have been aware that Higginson really, in a double sense, was risking death by entering into what he was doing.
Is there anything in your background research that would link Whitman with Lincoln? I have a volume that talks about his life before he went to Washington, and it states in there that he had a volume of Leaves of Grass in the Herndon Law Office on the table. And when he didn't have clients, he would pick it up and he would read constantly, just pacing the floor. But he was deeply influenced by it. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you're right. Lincoln did have a copy of Leaves of Grass back in his Illinois law office. Read Whitman, admired Whitman's work. Some critics have made a case that Lincoln's whole writing style changed after his reading of Leaves of Grass, that it was reading Whitman that allowed Lincoln to begin to develop the style that we associate with things like the Gettysburg Address, which has its own cataloging power to it, and some of his House Divided Address, for instance, which has very much of a Whitmanian tone to it. When Whitman lived in Washington, D.C., he wrote often in his letters about seeing Lincoln pass by, and they oftentimes Whitman would position himself on the route, because Lincoln would every night go out to the soldiers' home on the edge of town to sleep when it was too hot in D.C. to sleep, and he would go out with a small contingent of troops, and Whitman would stand on the street and they would nod to each other or wave to each other. There's a story told by one of Lincoln's top aides that they were standing in the White House one day looking out, and Whitman walked by. Whitman was 6 feet tall and large with the white beard, and he stood out in a 19th century crowd. Photographers used to stop him on the street, not knowing who he was, and just say, "Can you come in? I want to take your photograph." He's a very photographable guy. And he was walking by the White House that day, and Lincoln was just looking out the window, and he said, "Who is that man?" And one of his aides said, "That's Walt Whitman, the poet, sir." And Lincoln looked at him and said, "Well, that's a man." So there's a lot of interest. Of course, Whitman, after the war, gave what was called his Lincoln Lecture for many years, honoring Lincoln. And there's a book, if anybody's interested in this relationship, it's, as far as I'm concerned, has some real flaws to it, but it's a beautifully written book. Daniel Mark Epstein on Whitman and Lincoln and their whole relationship.
Yeah, I think that's the one I have, and it mentions prominently Lincoln's address at the Cooper Union in New York, and that he thinks that Whitman and Lincoln actually spoke to each other on the street there in New York.
Right. And there's no evidence. That's
Yeah.
one of the problems I have with the book.
Yeah.
He imagines a lot of encounters, and he imagines that the whole reason Whitman went to Washington to work, or stayed in Washington after he went to Fredericksburg to take care of his wounded brother, that he stayed in Washington because he wanted to get a job working for Lincoln so that he could get to know Lincoln and be with Lincoln. But that in fact
There's
is
no
just
real
wrong.
evidence to it, yeah. The other question that I have is much farther afield, and I don't know whether there's anything to it at all. Emily Dickinson has a poem in the last stanza of which she uses the phrase, "This is the hour of lead." And it's a description of a person responding to death. And it's one of the most beautiful things I have ever read in my life. You know, this woman understood what it was to grieve. Was that written around the time of the Civil War? Did it have anything to do with it?
Yeah, that's another great question. I mean, the dating of her poems is a real problem because she left, all of her poems were found in her dresser drawer. Some of them were sewn up in hand-sewn, what came to be called fascicles, little handmade booklets of her poems. Others were just on scraps of paper. Her handwriting shifted and changed over the years. We know that she did most of those fascicles in the 1860s. The early editors, including Higginson, to the chagrin of everyone who's tried to work on Dickinson since then, took those fascicles apart and removed all the paper. One scholar spent pretty much a lifetime of his scholarship putting all of those back together, using the pinholes to line things up to try to reconstruct the fascicles, which has now been done, and now people are trying to actually read the fascicles. But the poem you mentioned, which ends, as I recall, with the line, first the stupor, then the letting go. It's an amazing poem. She imagines so many poems where it's imagining up to the moment of death, and many of those are put into the persona of a soldier who's just been shot, and the last, oftentimes listening to the sounds of victory around him and not being able to capture that sound of victory. So it's often very hard to tell where those poems fall. Sometimes you can tell because the handwriting changes, it gets a lot stranger toward the end of her life, and so you can tell the very late poems, but the problem is the 1860s, she thought she was losing her eyesight, and she sat down and recopied all of her poems. And so they're all in the same hand, and you just have to guess. Sometimes you can tell because she sends them in letters, and the letters are dated, but
It just seems like before the Civil War, death appears. Before the Civil War, death appears in her poetry as not exactly a caricature, but as a thing, external. And somehow with the war, immediately it's taken inside and it's personal and it hurts deeply. That's a big change.
it is a big change. And that's a very perceptive comment, because I think you're absolutely right. It's beginning to experience death from the inside that happens at that moment.
At what point during the war was Whitman's sentence written?
That again is that's a hard one to tell because we have the manuscripts I showed you of where he's first working on those. I'm guessing, I've worked with Whitman's handwriting for many, many decades now, and I'm guessing that those lines were written in probably late 1864 because they're surrounded with other memories of of going to very recent Civil War cemeteries were just beginning to be set up in those first years after the war. Some of you may have read Drew Gilpin Faust's book, This Republic of Suffering, which is all about death in the Civil War and how death was handled. And one chapter is about the setting up of the cemeteries. So that sentence, it's always difficult with Whitman because little pieces, you'll find the starts of Whitman poems that will be 15 years before a poem finally gets written. But in a notebook, 15 years before, he's written 3 lines that he then lifts out and finally uses in a poem maybe 10 years later or 15 years later. And this is a sentence that you can tell by looking at those. I don't know how well you could see the manuscripts here, but they're just filled with insertions and rethinkings and reinscriptions, and that's his method. He likes to give the impression with his poetry of it having just all flows out, just a spontaneous overflow of emotion, as Wordsworth called it. He would want that to be there, but when you look at his manuscripts, I edit the Walt Whitman archive that's online, and you can just call up the Whitman archive, just Google Walt Whitman archive, and it'll come up, and you can look at hundreds and hundreds of his manuscripts, and you can see just how it's as if almost he never stayed with a single word he initially wrote. He's continually rethinking and rethinking and rethinking. So I think this is a sentence that probably, I know, it was worked over for many, many years. But I think he actually started writing it right at the end of the war as he was just thinking, now, how are we going to deal with all of these unclaimed dead bodies that are strewn across the American landscape? And Faust's book, This Republic of Suffering, that one chapter dealing with, ironically, the officer who was in charge of the gigantic effort to bury all the soldiers, literally just took troops, many of them black troops, because as you probably know, at the end of the war, when the troops were generally disbanded, most white troops went back to jobs and homes they had, but many, many of the black soldiers, that was the job they had. It was the only job they had. They had no place to go back to. And so black soldiers were on those burial details, and it was a great time for coffin makers because the government decided every soldier's body would have a coffin. So coffins were being delivered all across the country. It's a great chapter. Faust has done an amazing job of pulling together this story. I started to say the officer in charge of that burial detail was named Whitman. No relation, but thank you all very much.
Thank you.